You may have seen the interview in last week's Guardian, an interview with Buddhist monk, teacher, friend of the Dalai Lama, Mathieu Ricard, by Emma Beddington. Ricard's an awesome figure. Emma Beddington is an excellent writer. No gripe with any of them. And yet, it seems useful to investigate the premises, the pitch, what that piece seems to be telling us and the way in which it chooses to tell us. And in a sense, we probably don't need to go any further than the title and the subtitle, which I'm assuming that Emma Beddington probably had nothing to do with anyway, probably her sub-editor. But the world's happiest man, ? Secrets of a serene, successful, satisfying life. And we can begin to ask so many questions, and the obvious one is happiness. What on earth is it anyway? And do we want it? Why do we want it? What do we think it is? And, oh, I didn't realise it was a race, because apparently this is the world's happiest man. He won. That's a shame, but maybe he can teach me something about how I could be happier. And of course, being the world's happiest man, he obviously has secrets. And we like secrets. Secrets are something which I have and you don't. Or maybe you have, maybe I can find out. Maybe there's an offer here. Maybe I give something and I get traded a secret. But then if it's really a secret, how come so many people does anybody know? And maybe this is it. Maybe this is the fix. Maybe if I get this secret, the real secret, then I'll be fixed and I'll be happy. And that's great. And if that seems a bit silly, it's still the way, completely, that it's presented. And Emma Beddington starts out in a way, goes along with this quite nicely, really. This interview feels intimidating. The rigour of a French intellectual. He has a PhD in cellular genetics, has written books on altruism, meditation and compassion, with the wisdom you get from 50 plus years of intense spiritual practice. I, says Emma, have the profundity of a Pop-Tart and told a fruit fly to fuck off this morning. Like so many of us, I've spent most of my life wondering about happiness. Is it really achievable? How? Is it selfish to even strive for it? So happiness definitely is a thing. It's something we can have. Maybe something we can even be. And I'm not laughing because in a sense this is the question we're all asking permanently in the hole down which we all fall permanently. It's why we come, part of why we come to practice. I'm looking for it, the secret, the fix, the answer. And of course here, as so often, click on this. Yeah, let's have some secrets. Let's find out. Let's get it sorted once and for all. In one sense, Ricard's perfectly clear himself that this is the wrong word. Can we find it? Oh yeah. He did write the book called Happiness. I wanted to call it Suffering, he says, which makes me laugh, imagining his publishers' faces. But for once he says he's deadly serious. No, it's true. And in that sense, it should have been Suffering, because suffering is at the heart of our practice. What's the difference between being driven by our suffering, the actual experiencing of our suffering, and being driven by this reaching after happiness? What's the difference? Are they the same thing? What's implied? Buddhism does have a long relationship in the West with this word happiness. Thich Nhat Hanh actually talks about happiness a lot. It's one of the problems with what we can call smiley face Buddhism. Be happy. If you're doing it right, you will be happy. All we have to do is be happy. Don't dwell on the negative. Accentuate the positive. Eliminate the negative. And yet, Thich Nhat Hanh also talks deeply, at length, about suffering, about his suffering, about the suffering of those around him, the suffering of his country during the Vietnam War and for decades afterwards, the suffering of being in exile. This is no smiley face Buddhism, and yet it can come across that way. Happiness is a funny word. Is it? Might be 20 years ago, something like that. The King of Bhutan came up with this idea of gross national happiness as an alternative, as a foil to the economic measuring of gross national product, with the idea, which is completely sensible, that at the end of the day, a country's wealth was better measured by the happiness of its people than the balance sheet of economic import, export, production and the rest of it. Great idea. And yet happiness has also become, well, complicated, hasn't it? The positive psychology movement, much concerned with happiness. Psychology is always concerned with pathology, it argued. Failure, collapse, breakdown, problem. Can we not talk about what's positive in life? Isn't happiness a useful measure? Endless surveys you'll probably read, sort of, now Finland is 1% happier than Sweden. How did this come about? Does that mean anything? What's it mean? And the whole of the well-being movement. Simply not being ill is not enough. We have to be well, healthy, healthier than, well, it's back to being a competition. So this word, happy, which is at one level so bland, seems to point some very different directions. So happiness, and the world's happiest man. Maybe happiness is a way we want to talk about suffering without actually mentioning it. And we can talk in the most general and most bland and most non-upsetting terms about lack of suffering without having to get messy and specific and unhappy. So what is happiness? We seem to agree it's some kind of desirable state. I could be happy if. I don't know what the if is, but I could be happy. I should be happy. I owe it to myself to be happy. Am I losing out? Am I suffering now? And actually, serious question. How would life actually be different if I was happy? And am I imagining that this is continuous? Or that I'm just happy a lot? Or that I'm happier than I've ever been? What on earth do I think this is? How did Ricard get this title, the world's happiest man, anyway? He says this is guff. In 2004, a research project. So, scientists thought, we've got our electric gizmos that we can wire up to the brain, we can watch bits of the brain. Who might have interesting brains to watch? And of course, this is the same time that the Dalai Lama was getting very interested in science as a way of rationally exploring Buddhism and selling it to the West. This is not some hocus pocus. This is rational stuff. We can prove it. We can show the difference in people's brains. Maybe we can even show the difference with happiness, with Buddhist practice. So they did this. A 2004 research project that analysed his brain as he meditated on compassion. The electroencephalogram recorded unprecedented levels of gamma waves associated with well-being and focus. His meditation also activated an area of the brain associated with positive emotions. And it was this that granted him the honorary title of the world's happiest man. As Ricard himself says, this is utter bunkum in a world of so many billion people. Effectively says, well, maybe there's some guy that's blissed out the whole time. Yeah, but even if there were, is that what we're after? That what we're trying for? Should we be trying? Anyway, he offered some resistance to this, but his spiritual teacher's grandson told him, take it and use it, stop fighting it. Is that a good plan? If we start talking about happiness, people will listen. Yeah. But what ideas are they bringing? And how do we work with those ideas? So we think of happiness as some kind of desirable state, and Ricard himself points to the ancient Greek idea of eudaimonia, which we can define as, well, it's actually quite difficult. It's sort of well-being, it's sort of doing what one does as well as one can do it. It's to live a virtuous life, but this means being good, but not being good. As in, it's nothing to do with how we treat other people in what we might think of in contemporary terms as an ethical sense. It's being good at what we do. So to be a good warrior is to be courageous, cunning, devious. To be the highest kind of person is to be rational, to be able to think well. And these are to be full of pride, to be generous. But not to be generous to help other people, but to be generous to display one's possessions, one's character. And it's more complicated than this still, because Aristotle, kind of the classic author that we go to for the idea of eudaimonia, it would be difficult to live this eudaimonic life without being good looking, without having powerful friends, without having children who were filial, obeyed you, who were healthy. It actually begins to sound unbelievably conventional. It's like a kind of ancient Greek tick box list of, what we might in most cliched terms think of as happiness. Is this what we're trying to get out of Buddhist practice, out of Zen practice, really? If I want powerful friends, this isn't the place to get them. The alternative to that, which is often tied much more closely to Buddhism, is the kind of Stoic approach. Nothing outside of this can affect me. It's the classic, I am the general of the Imperial Roman army. My son has just been killed horribly in front of me in battle, and yet I am unaffected by this. I knew he would die. He was performing his filial duty. I remain completely unmoved. Nothing can affect me. This is one idea of equanimity. As I've tried to stress so often, this is not the Buddhist, not the Zen idea of equanimity, but it kind of dovetails with how we think about monastic practice. It's a wonderful little saying of Barry's. If you ain't got nothing, you ain't got nothing to lose. The path of renunciation. If I give up all external attachments, I'm impeccable. I'm immaculate. I am untouchable. Except, of course, in reality, I'm not. And Ricard is a monk who's given up all attachments, and yet he spends his life, much of it, jetting around the world, going to conferences, except for the last 3 years where he's been looking after his dying mother in France. Did that not affect him? Did that not impinge upon this happiness? I don't know. I haven't read the 800 pages of the new book, and maybe he gets around to that and maybe he doesn't. But it's the kind of question we need to ask about this. I feel actually this just leaves us in a complete muddle. Happiness. Yeah, be great, wouldn't it? I think actually Emma Beddington comes at this more interestingly. She says, more or less, she's always been very bad at happiness. See if I can find that bit. Oh yeah, they talk about pleasure, which is perfectly fine but not happiness. I struggle with this part, I tell him. I see pleasure, small joys, as an accessible form of happiness. Enjoying nature, my family, cake. That's not bad, is it? There's a hint of the professor he almost became dealing with a dozy student as he replies. And of course he explains the classic Buddhist argument. These small pleasures are fine, but they are not happiness because they are transitory, they are impermanent. We are looking for permanence, the untouchable, the unassailable. And if this sounds like majorly not what we're thinking about in terms of ordinary mind practice, that's because really it isn't. This is taking it in a very different and much more, dare I say it, conventional, dualistic direction. Surely those tiny pleasures, those awarenesses, those experiencings are life itself. And there's no need to dismiss them for merely being passing. It's not that they aren't happiness, it's that they're an entirely different thing. Happiness, in the sense of what we acquire, as if what we become, perhaps to some degree through practice, is not permanent pleasure. If I want that, there are easier sources. Possibly. It's a bit like saying, which is better? Which is more pleasurable, yellow or chess? It doesn't make any kind of sense as a question. Pleasure is one of our most important and vital modes of experiencing. Pain is a much less welcome but vital mode of experiencing. What practice is about is not a thing or a state. It's not ultimately about permanence or impermanence. It's about being the world as it shows up as me. It's about this awareness of our experience. This awareness of not separate. Or even not the awareness of not separate, simply the experiencing, which isn't separate. Where even the question of not separate doesn't arise. In which case, if it's experiencing, if it's awareness, if it's non-separation, it's just about the simple activities, the engagement of caring and loving. It's not about being a better person. It's not being a better kind of person. It's not about being always happy or always cheerful or anything. There's one image here which still seems totally relevant. It's Joko's of a bigger container, in the way that it ties up with the very traditional Buddhist image of the ocean. The vastness of the ocean as holding all. We become not separate from the ocean. We become in a container that vast, if momentarily, if fractionally, for everything. And we can call that happiness. But I don't know whether it would or wouldn't show up on an electroencephalogram. And I don't know whether the editor of The Guardian would think that it was a good description of it. We could try and find other words, but they're probably equally useless. Contentment. It's quite nice, but whatever. Questions. No answers. I'm sure we'll all carry on seeking every kind of happiness, and I'm sure that's fine. But it might be worth asking to stop and think. What and why?